I'm Michael Taylor. I am the Artistic Director and Chief Curator, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to tonight's opening lecture for A Long Arc, this much anticipated exhibition of photography. I want to thank our wonderful American Sign Language interpreters here, Melody Winters and Bernice Venuto, who always do such a great job of signing for these talks. And I'll also remind you that tonight's talk is being live streamed, so there's many people at home. We say hello to you too. So, A Long Arc, Photography in the American South since 1845, has been co-curated by Sarah Kennel, VMFA's Aaron Siskind Curator of Photography and Director of the Raysor Center, along with Gregory J. Harris, who is the Curator of Photography at the High Museum in Atlanta. On view at the museum until January the 26th, 2025, this exhibition takes visitors on an epic journey through the American South from 1845 to today, and includes more than 200 photographs. Now, when you put that with the other exhibition we have on view at the same time, American Born Hungry, which is curated by our great director and CEO, Alex Nargis, we have a feast for photography lovers. I really feel like Virginia right now. Virginia is the place to be if you want to see photography. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarah Kennel, who joined VMFA in June 2021 as the inaugural Aaron Siskind Curator of Photography and Director of the Raysor Center. A specialist in 19th and 20th century photography, Sarah has curated, published, and presented widely on topics ranging from 19th century French photography and historic photographic processes to European modernism and understudied women photographers. She has also written extensively on the relationship between painting and photography in 19th century France, and completed a dissertation on dance and the visual arts in early 20th century culture. Before joining VMFA, Sarah held positions at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, where you may remember she curated the acclaimed traveling exhibition, Sally Mann, 1,000 Crossings. And she began her career at the National Gallery of Art, so she has had such a distinguished career. We were thrilled to bring her here in 2021, and she has done unbelievable things. And one of the things she spoke about in her job interview was this exhibition, A Long Arc, that contemplated the South and its impact on photography and visual culture. And she really didn't have to finish that sentence. We were so enraptured by it, and we thought that would be an amazing exhibition to bring to VMFA. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Kennel to the stage, and she'll tell you more.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's so rewarding to be a curator here because the community really shows up and engages with all the programs we do, so thank you. And I'd also like to thank our education department and the folks who put together these and many other programs like them. They don't all have to be here tonight, but they are, so thank you very much. So this exhibition came about around 5 years ago when I was a curator at the High Museum of Art, which has a very strong collection of Southern photography. And at the time, my co-curator, Greg, and I were in the planning stages for an anniversary show on that museum's Picturing the South commissioning initiative, which essentially started in 1996. The High Museum began commissioning contemporary artists to picture the South. So we thought we might do a small show alongside this anniversary show, showing the prehistory up to 1996. But as we began delving into the subject matter, we realized it really deserved a larger stage in its own exhibition. Another reason we really wanted to explore this topic was because we recognized how much extraordinary contemporary photography is being made in the South right now, in this region. And in fact, there's been a couple wonderful shows on this subject matter in the last 10 years. So we wanted to think about what really brought us to this point. But I think the third reason that we really wanted to focus on this subject is that we really began to think about how what was happening in the last 5-10 years in the American South in many ways has been a kind of touch point for many questions about who we are as Americans, where we are as a country, our culture, our identity, and our history. And we began to think about the American South really as a kind of crucible for American identity and not this kind of exotic other that has often played within history. And that's true both for American history writ large, but also photo history. And so as we began to look at the history of photography in the South, we realized that so many important movements within photography either emerged, took root in the South, or became fully developed in the American South, yet that hasn't been recognized in that history. So in this exhibition, we really look at the history of photography from the perspective of the South, but also how photography in the American South has shaped our understanding of both American history and our present. I'm going to launch in now to the exhibition. I'm going to give you an overview of this show, which is organized chronologically, with one small exception. And it is 200 pictures. It's a long arc. It's a big show. I have my phone up here so that I know if I'm going too long. I don't have to wait for you to start streaming out. But I do want to give an overview of the exhibition. I highly encourage you, though, to see the show if you haven't, mostly because these screens don't really do justice to the extraordinary pictures. One thing that surprised me when we first began working on this exhibition was actually how early photography arrived in the American South. Photography was publicly introduced to the world in 1839, and within several weeks of the process for making a daguerreotype, the first publicly known process of photography, there were experimenters trying to make these photographs in Alabama within a few weeks. And then within a year or two of the process being publicly demonstrated in France, there were commercial photo studios in places like Richmond. So I think we have to remember that, the South has never been a backwater for the history of photography. In fact, one of the early pictures in the exhibition is not only made in Richmond, but it is of Richmond. It's the picture you see on the screen. This is a daguerreotype. So daguerreotypes are small photographs made on metal plates directly in the camera. So there's no negative involved, and therefore each one is one of a kind. And they're made by taking a sheet of metal that's been covered with a layer of silver. It's highly polished. It's placed in the camera. It's exposed to fumes of mercury and iodine, so it's not OSHA approved. But they produce these wonderful mirror-like images. In fact, one of the names for daguerreotype at the time was a mirror with a memory. Now, the photographer who made this picture boasted that he had made more than 30,000 portraits in Richmond over his career. And this sounds like an extraordinary number, but in fact, the first and most popular use for photography in the first decade of its existence was portraiture, right? Suddenly, for the first time, middle-class people could have an image of themselves. And so much photography that was produced in the United States was a form of portraiture. City views like this are rare in general, and then for Richmond, particularly rare. I know of only a few other views of the city made in this daguerreotype process. This was probably made around 1847, we're not totally sure, but it's made from the studio of William Abbott Pratt, looking down Main Street between 15th and 14th. Some of those buildings still exist today, allowing us to figure out where this was made. I think what's also telling about this picture is that it's made in the heart of the publishing and printing industry. And I'm going to point out, there's a little sign right there. You can't read it here, but you probably can downstairs for a bookstore. That'll be important in a minute. But it's also in the heart of Richmond's slave trade. A number of firms auctioned enslaved people under these awnings here. And I think that combination of industry and wealth, within the South, and the role of photography is important. And it really comes to play in many of the extraordinary portraits in this exhibition. Take, for example, the portrait on the right of two free men of color. This is a gorgeous daguerreotype from the Chrysler Museum, and it shows us two very well-dressed, obviously secure, confident men. We don't know their names, but they have been identified as free men of color. And the portrait really makes me think about the abolitionist Frederick Douglass's understanding of photography's potential to change people's ideas about race. He embraced photography specifically as an abolitionist tool because he felt that it was a form of collaborative portraiture in which the inner humanity of the subject was presented to the world, and that unlike many negative stereotypes that were reproduced in drawings and paintings, photography enabled the sitter to kind of take charge of their identity. But I also wonder what it meant for these two men to have their portrait made in the middle of Richmond, just down the street from places where other human beings were being sold. The wonderful portrait on the left is another example of the use of portraiture to kind of shape and project identity, and that may also surprise us about what we think about as 19th century Richmond, and particularly ideas around masculinity. We know the sitter is Philip Dougherty. He was a bookstore clerk in that little bookstore that is visible in the previous daguerreotype. He was also an amateur musician. He raised rare fowl as an avocation, and you might notice this prop falcon, literally propped on his shoulder. I have no doubt that he brought in his own costumes for this fancy dress portrait, which has actually been beautifully hand-colored. This was actually typical to include some hand coloring on daguerreotypes, but a piece like this would have been a showpiece for both the photographer and the sitter. Dougherty was often described as a kind of confirmed bachelor, theatrical, flamboyant. I think take with that what you will, but I know for me, certainly, it expanded my idea of what kind of heteronormative 19th century Southern masculinity could look like. And so I embrace photographs like this as both extraordinary demonstrations of the art of photography in its earliest years, but also we see how it expands our understanding of the kind of social context of photography. There are other photographs that could fall into the category of domestic portraiture that nevertheless intersect quite directly with the politics and culture of race and slavery in the South. This is one such portrait, but there are many others that exist of white families, and particularly white children, shown with their enslaved companions. And these nanny portraits have puzzled me and other viewers. One explanation for perhaps why white slaveholding families would commission photographs with enslaved members of their household in them was a demonstration of wealth and possession. But I think a more interesting and perhaps compelling argument is that at this time there was significant abolitionist pressure on the South. There are many people in the United States and elsewhere, Britain and France, who were agitating for the end of this inhumane practice. And portraits like these proposed a kind of paternalistic view of slavery, in that children were treated as almost equals, or at least as companions and playmates. So it was an attempt to naturalize a deeply unnatural system of subjugation. It also, though, reminds us of the kind of complexity of social interactions at this time, that photography was called upon to capture the intimacy of these interactions within both family life, but under a system that also produced alienation and exploitation. Now, most people's understanding of Southern photography in the 19th century, if you ask them what photographs were made in the South in the 19th century, most people would think of the Civil War. This actually is the sort of first major conflict that was thoroughly documented in photography, the Crimean War before that. But I think the American Civil War was a huge engine for photographic production, and photography also deeply shaped the way that Americans understood the war. And even if they didn't see photographs, many of the photographs produced during the American Civil War were translated into woodcut engravings and reproduced in popular magazines like Harper's Weekly. One of the major markets for photography at this time was actually soldiers and their families. Enterprising photographers like Isaac Bonsall here would immediately set up studios. They were following the armies, predominantly attached to Northern armies, because after the first year of the Civil War, a blockade prevented materials from coming to photography studios in the South. So we must also recognize that many of the photographs made during the American Civil War were made by photographers who were traveling and more or less embedded with or following on the heels of Northern Union armies. But these photographers would set up shop, and by this time, there were multiple ways of making small, inexpensive photographs, not just daguerreotypes, but also similar cased objects on metal, on tin, like glass, or on paper. And these were very much keepsakes for the family. Many people were going off to war, not sure that they would come back. There are many stories of soldiers dying, clutching photographs, of family members in their hands. But we also see that it's an opportunity to kind of define one's identity in terms of being a Southerner or a Northerner or a military member. And we see here, for example, a soldier who's dressed up. The background looks like a line of other soldiers on horseback, but it was clearly a painted backdrop. And the best photographers would have a number of different backdrops that you could choose from. And sometimes soldiers indulged in a bit of fakery. They would actually assume ranks that they didn't actually achieve in reality, but perhaps they sent home, hoping to make their parents proud. Now, one of the more extraordinary sets of photographs in this section of the exhibition are these four. They are showing the 2nd Regiment, which was a black regiment, an artillery regiment that was active between 1864 and 1866. And we know that they were active at the Battle of Nashville, which is maybe where this sequential series of photographs showing them loading and firing a cannon were made. Now, it's extraordinary for a couple reasons. One, we don't have that many photographs of black soldiers with weapons. This is the only known set of these 4 prints. But also, I think you can see the ways in which photography wasn't quite yet able to capture battle scenes. Photographers were using larger format cameras. They had to prepare their negatives. I think it's a misconception. Many people think the exposure times at this moment were minutes long. They were seconds or less than that. But the technology was not yet able to capture the heat of the battle. Nevertheless, there was a desire to kind of document, and you can see that here in the sequential photographs. I think the pictures also, though, raise questions around citizenship and identity, and we see the way that these photographs propose a new identity of black soldiers, of black citizens. There's just a detail, but I do encourage you to look at the original, and you can sort of see they're crouched. They're clearly trying to look like action shots, but they are slightly awkward and charming. Now, photography really did intersect with not only debates around the war itself, but also with ideas around abolitionism and the conditions of slavery in the South. And the photographers knew that their audiences would be attuned to kind of reading different messages, different levels of messaging within the photographs. This, for example, is a photograph by Andrew J. Russell of a firm called Price, Birch and Company. And in fact, a photograph of this, the old slave pen, had been made the year before by another photographer, Matthew Brady, and had been circulated through mass production, these little carte de visites, kind of as a symbol of, what the Union Army was fighting for. It was fighting against the continuation of this system. Russell actually makes this picture a year later when the jail for enslaved people has been turned into a jail for captured Confederate soldiers. And the irony of its transformation for that purpose would not have been lost on the audiences. And often these were reproduced then with additional captions to kind of provide you with that information. Another series of portraits that demonstrate the ways in which photography at this time was used to kind of create a narrative around the war, and a justification for war, and a sort of a rhetoric around abolitionism was a series by a studio photographer named Charles Paxson, photographing emancipated children in New Orleans. And we see these three children, Rosa, Charlie, and Rebecca, sort of posed almost as a family unit, wrapped in flags. And they are supposed to represent the horrors of enslavement and appeal to, particularly to white sensibilities in the North, and perhaps reestablish support for the war, which at this time had been dragging on. There were a lot of losses. Not everybody supported the war effort anymore. One of the things about this set of pictures that other scholars have recognized is how light-skinned these children are, and that was most likely a deliberate choice on the part maybe of the photographer, but certainly on those who commissioned and then sold these photographs to support abolitionist efforts, because it suggests that perhaps white Northerners would be more empathetic to children who looked more like their own. So it's a complicated set of pictures, on the one hand supporting a progressive cause, and on the other reinforcing kind of racial hierarchies based on skin tone. So I think hopefully by now you've gotten the sense here that photography in this period in the South was very much both an art of the personal, the domestic identity, and yet these are never really separated from the very powerful cultural and historical and political dynamics that were shaping everyday life, as well as the kind of geopolitics of the Civil War. There were, of course, and we have included, some of the most famous photographs produced during the Civil War. Now, there's been extraordinary exhibitions focused just on Civil War photography. The Metropolitan Museum did one in 2015, and it's exhaustive. And there are many scholars who can tell you each particular battle from each photograph. We really didn't want to go too far down that history, but we felt it was important to also show some of the works that really resonated with people, not just during the war, but particularly after. Coming to terms with the aftermath of the war was a challenge for many Americans, and there was a journalist who talked about the desire and the demand for photographs like these of kind of death on the battlefield as a way to come to terms with loss. Similarly, the works by George Barnard are among the most affecting and powerful kind of reflections on the Civil War. He followed Sherman sort of down in the March to the Sea, photographing devastated cities and battlefields, but often with a very elegiac tone. You might notice here, there's one figure there, and actually a smaller one there. And they're both kind of looking out at this devastation in a way they are a kind of stand-in for the viewer, trying to come to terms with loss. Now, Barnard was also an extraordinarily talented photographer who had a deep attachment to the artistry and process of his work. And so his interest was not so much in documentation, but in creating an emotional impact. And for that reason, he often would make several negatives. You don't see it in this picture, but in others downstairs, you sometimes see these incredibly moody, dramatic, cloudy skies. And the only way he could achieve that with the current photographic technology was to make two negatives, one exposed for the landscape and one for the sky, and kind of splice them together. The other thing that Barnard's pictures and others like it did was kind of establish a trope, and one that would really sort of run through the history of photography after, which was thinking about the South, the landscape itself, as the site of sort of memory, loss, and death. And we'll see this kind of theme of the landscape really holding the scars of history as one that artists, 100 years later, like Sally Mann, are exploring. The next section of the exhibition is entitled Less Splendid on the Surface. And it's actually taken from a quote by the journalist Henry Grady, who was sort of a champion of the New South in the 1870s. And he was giving a speech saying, well, after the war, yes, the South is less beautiful. There's been a lot of devastation and ruin, but we're stronger at the core. We've now going to really focus on kind of the economic engines of growth. This is a story that we actually hear sort of multiple times at different parts of the history of the South. So this is the first kind of New South moment. And his focus on industrialization was not misplaced. This was a moment of the kind of attempts to transform what had been a kind of cotton and plantation economy into one of industry. It's also, though, an apt moment and phrase, perhaps, for the photography produced in this period. This is not sort of the high period of photographic achievement in the United States, but it is actually a period where we see the kind of rise of industrial processes in photography, including, the growth of things like chromolithography. So this is a way of making a photographic negative, translating it onto a printing plate, and adding colors to it. And William Henry Jackson, who made this picture in the South in Florida, was kind of a master creator and marketer of these images. But also in the exhibition, you see stereographs, other forms of kind of popular and easily accessible, industrially produced photography that disseminated visions of the South. Now, what these visions were really kind of depended. Here we see a sort of a painterly view of Florida, and note here there's a figure, it's actually two figures once again, kind of reflecting on the landscape. But the issue at this period, of course, is, despite Henry Grady's optimism that the South would be stronger, the promises of Reconstruction were cut short very quickly, and the abandonment of those promises and the violent and kind of radical enforcement of racial segregation really transformed and kind of, I wouldn't say transformed, but really cut short all of those promises of Reconstruction. In fact, what you're seeing here, it's a cyanotype, which is essentially a blueprint photograph of the erection of the monument at Liberty Place, kind of Orwellian named Liberty Place, because the monument was essentially erected to honor a white supremacist uprising. But photography bore witness also, to both the industrial transformation of the South and the continuation of many of its social and kind of labor practices. This photograph is by a man named John Horgan, who was known as a kind of industrial photographer. He made photographs for the railroad, and then he essentially got a gig photographing farms and plantations for a man named Colonel Edmondson, who was known as the Cotton King of the South, built one of the largest fortunes of the South. And Horgan here is photographing a plantation in Mississippi owned by his son. And photographs like these do a kind of political work. What we see here are many black laborers, actually dressed probably in their Sunday best, and they're out in the fields and they're picking cotton, but everything is sort of made to look peaceful and beautiful. There's another version of this, which is showing them at twilight, kind of holding hands. And of course, the reality was that for many black farmers, life continued to be extremely difficult, subsistence labor with the continuation of racial segregation. Not everybody in the South who was poor, of course, was a person of color. Lewis Hine, who was really a documentarian of child labor all across the country, spent a significant amount of time in the South. Here's a photograph that looks like it might just be sort of a nice day on the water, but in fact, he's documenting young people who are, I've learned the term is oyster tonging, not oyster fishing, in Florida. He also photographed children, ages 5 or 6, at the textile mills in Georgia, the Cherokee mills, and other places like that. So we see that photography is, used to both kind of naturalize exploitative systems of labor, but also to kind of push against that and raise consciousness. And of course, there was a lot of transformation, particularly for Black Americans in the South at this time, the rise of a lot of schools. Literacy had been prohibited under slavery by many people. And so the rise of schools like the Whittier School, which is a prep school in Phoebus, Virginia, which went through the 9th grade and taught not only literacy and math, but also art, music, and literature, was important. It was important enough for James Van Der Zee, to photograph here. And I always thought of Van Der Zee as the documentarian of Harlem. He sort of is best known for photographing all of the members of the Harlem Renaissance, but also just the incredible cultural ferment of Harlem in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. But in fact, before he got his start and opened a studio in Harlem, he spent a year and a half in Virginia making photographs. And then we have the establishment of not only Black colleges and universities like Tuskegee, but also of Black-owned and run photo studios. And in fact, there are Black photographers really from the history of photography in the exhibition. One of the earliest daguerreotypes is likely by J.P. Ball, a Black photographer from Virginia. But at this time, many more Black Americans had access to equipment, camera, and began to really use the medium to image themselves and their communities. These two prints are by P.H. Polk, who was the official photographer at Tuskegee Institute for more than 45 years. And he photographed students, faculty, he photographed the scientific, artistic, and literary achievements of the kind of Black intelligentsia or at Tuskegee and elsewhere. And he also created a series that really were about the sort of power of his elders, including the aptly named woman here, the boss. And I love this picture, not only because it's really well known among Polk's work, this kind of strong, proud woman makes me think once again about the power of portraiture to be a collaborative dialogue between subject and maker. But also because we have one of the few beautiful vintage prints of this, which is often seen in later prints. But we, here at VMFA, also included another work from our collection by Polk of a beautiful debutante, because we also want to really show the range of Polk's practice, but also the range of sort of identities and experiences of the many people that he photographed. The third part of the exhibition is sort of the first place where many people who might not have recognized any of the photographs so far might come to recognize some of the pictures or at least some of the names. And this section really focuses on work made in the American South during the Great Depression. And this is an important moment in photo history. It's really the emergence of a documentary language of photography, an American documentary language of photography, one that is also is both rooted in notions of objectivity and deeply tied to a kind of social consciousness. And I know that those two things are in conflict, and I think that's deliberate. What I think people haven't necessarily recognized is how many of the most impactful photographs from this period were made in the American South. Now, the impact of the Great Depression on the South, an area that was already poorer than the rest of the country, was devastating. And in addition to economic havoc, there was already, of course, entrenched racism and segregation, and then the decimation of rural populations and farms. Many of the people who were coming to photograph these conditions in the South were from elsewhere, and many of them were hired by the U.S. government, as we'll see. People like Dorothea Lange and Marion Post Wolcott were actually hired by the U.S. government under the auspices of what was at first called the Resettlement Agency and later changed to the Farm Security Agency, you might call it FSA, to document these conditions, in part to garner widespread and congressional support for aid and resettlement packages. So these were sort of photographs that were meant to move you, to open your eyes to what was happening in a place that might not be near you. But there were many other photographers as well who were working for the vast number of publications that emerged at this time. Life magazine, Look magazine, this was the moment, the explosion of kind of picture culture. So we see in this moment really both of these sort of vehicles for photography. And I begin with this picture by Margaret Burke White, in part because it feels terribly relevant. It was made in 1937 after a major flood in Louisville. And what we see here, of course, is this billboard in the background proclaiming, the highest standard of living. And we see this sort of, family with a dog and the nice car and their big smiles, and the contrast between the reality for many Americans in the South. And this irony, this sort of deliberate contrast, using words, using body language, is also one that other artists will explore during this time. And Burke White was a Life magazine photographer. This appeared in Life. She actually made this photograph from a raft. I just learned this. But there were many others whose work really documented the kind of significant conditions of poverty in the American South and across the American South, the Deep South, Texas, Arkansas. I haven't really defined the American South because we've sort of let the pictures in the show define it. My co-curator and I decided that we would sort of use the census definition of the American South. It got a little fuzzy around places like Texas, kind of East Texas. But we really let the pictures drive the selection in the exhibition. One of the most powerful set of pictures made in the American South at this time are by Dorothea Lange. Many of you probably are familiar with her famous photograph, Migrant Mother, made in California. Clearly, she did not photograph exclusively in the South. In fact, she honed her eye for really finding the kind of gesture, expression, body language of her subjects, to convey the greatest emotional depth and complexity in California. But when she came to the American South, she was particularly attuned to conditions around race and gender, but also just notice how she choreographs the figures here. These are 5 tenant farmers who have all lost their farms. So they are displaced, and it's a group portrait where everybody is completely disconnected and in their own world. And she frequently finds a kind of physical choreography to convey inner emotional states. Or take, for example, a woman here, Lang's title was Ex-Slave with a Long Memory, and she often sort of provided a kind of strong editorial viewpoint on her photographs with her titles. But I don't think we need the title to look into the face and the grip of the hand and the proud cheek to understand that this woman has led a very tenacious yet difficult life. One of the other photographers, and perhaps one of the most famous ones to make work in the American South in this period, was Walker Evans. And again, most of the photographers at this time coming to the American South were not Southerners. This is kind of the same situation as in the Civil War. They were coming to the South in order to present a picture of it to a broader audience, and they frequently saw it with their individual eyes and interests. And I think that especially goes for Walker Evans. Now, a lot of the photographs in this section, we call them documentary photographs. His work really kind of married a documentary aesthetic with a sort of intentionality around making a picture. He used a large format camera with film. He was not working on the fly. He was not interested in capturing an ephemeral moment or that choreography of bodies in the same way that Lang or inner emotional states as he was, and sort of almost a distant cataloging of appearances. And I think it's partly what accounts for the incredible pull that these pictures have in real life. They look like nothing on the screen. The amount of sort of detail and beauty that we find in the sort of everyday vernacular interiors. He also made one of his most famous set of photographs, and in fact, his most famous photograph, perhaps, in the American South in Hale County, Alabama. He didn't work for the FSA for very long. He preferred to kind of do his own thing. And in 1935, he went to Hale County along with a writer named James Agee on an assignment for Fortune magazine. And the assignment was really to look at look at the conditions of tenant farmers in Hale County, focused on three white tenant farmer families. And Evans made the pictures. Agee was supposed to write the text. Fortune never published this, but in 1941, the pair did publish a book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. I've known this book. It's kind of a seminal tome in the history of photography. I always thought it was a sort of bestseller from the start, and it was only in doing research for this exhibition that I realized that something like fewer than 600 copies sold in 1941. It was reissued in the 1960s when it was suddenly embraced. It's kind of the new journalism. I think also that, along with a kind of renewed attention to the civil rights movement, really turned that book into the classic that it is today. In making these pictures, this one in particular, Evans originally titled her really just The Sharecropper's Wife. Her name is Allie Mae Burroughs, and she's the wife of one of the main subjects of the photographs. And like Dorothea Lang's Migrant Mother, this is sort of Evans's version. This photograph became produced over and over again, kind of like the Madonna of the Depression. And often her expression here, this kind of tight-lipped, sort of straight, resilient, intense, steely gaze has often been read as kind of evidence of her experience of poverty and challenge. Over the years, as she was interviewed about this picture and the impact on her lives, it's clear that another story emerges. She actually resisted the whole subject matter. She understood at some level that the man from the East Coast wielding the camera also wielded most of the power in how she and her family were going to be represented. This was a moment also of a lot of kind of scurrilous novels around, poor white Southern cultures. And so can we read into her expression one of resistance or anger, perhaps, not at the condition of her life so much as in this particular interaction? I don't have an answer for that, but I just bring it up. It's always a great thing to also bring to photo classes. But I also wanted to just bring in this question of documentary objectivity, particularly as it pertains to the photography of the South, both in the 1930s, and it comes up over and over again. And just to kind of close off the discussion of Evans, this is one of the pictures of Floyd Burroughs, Allie Mae's husband, with the children from one of the other families, pictures that he published. And here is a picture that he did not publish until the 1970s. And I think you can see that this is how the family posed for their pictures when they had the choice, maybe after church, hair pulled back, clean clothes, as a kind of unit, a family unit. And so I just like to bring these up. Also, when we look at pictures, as the lens of truth, we have to ask the question of whose truth. And one of the ways in which people countered this kind of stereotyping was by commissioning their own pictures, by going to photo studios and dressing as they wished and having their portraits made. And again, in this section, we include the self-authored photographs, whether by Mike Disfarmer, a rather strange man who set up a photo studio in Heber Springs, Arkansas for many years, and kind of the work from his studio was sort of a wonderful cataloging of kind of predominantly white Americans in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, but also this extraordinary series by Evelyn Massengel, who's part of a family of itinerant photographers in Arkansas who actually set up a mobile studio on the back of their truck and essentially produced penny pictures for hire. And what I love is how in the times in between sessions, she would make photographs of herself, documenting her life, her marriage, her child, and how she added such beautiful decoration to them. So there are always two sides to every story, at least. And the last thing I want to bring up, this is a wonderful pair of photographs, is just, again, it's the way that different photographers see the same thing so differently. This is a pair of photographs made on the same day at the same place. On the left by Edward Weston, a photographer who many of you may, if you know, you might think of the famous bell peppers or the dunes in California, not of a plantation in Louisiana. And on the right by Clarence John Laughlin, who was a Southern photographer, kind of known as maybe the father of American photographic surrealism. But Weston was photographing for an edition of Leaves of Grass, and they photographed together, and what I love is how they saw it so differently. So we kind of have, Weston sort of makes this nice balance and crisp composition. He's balancing the columns with the trees, everything is just so, and he sort of minimized this architecture in a way by showing it from a side angle. And Laughlin here really gins it up. I mean, he's probably doing a little darkroom magic to make it look like, we've got this eerie light glowing on these columns. We're seeing it straight on and crop, so it looks immensely high, this building. But just in case you didn't get the idea, he's also posed Weston's wife and collaborator, Karis, up in the window wearing this veil to look like a ghost haunting the plantation. And in a way, this idea of the ghost of history haunting the South, that was Laughlin's main subject matter. And it's one that relates, of course, to Southern Gothic literature. The last thing I'll say about this pair, though, is that they it's important that there's a car there, because the transformation in American culture with the kind of widespread adaptation of the automobile also transformed photographic practice, and it really kind of invented the road trip. Like suddenly photographers from all over could travel and make pictures, and they were getting grants to make pictures. They were applying for Guggenheims, and so this idea of leaving where you lived and discovering another place through photography was aided and embedded by the automobile, and the South was no exception to that, as we'll see in the next section. I'm going to take a quick water break while you enjoy these beautiful pictures. So the next section of the exhibition looks at this period between sort of the end of the Second World War and kind of the end of the Civil Rights Movement. It is a section in which we really focus on contradiction and ideas of contradiction and dissonance, because that is sort of what I was seeing in the pictures and thinking about, that America's image of itself after the war, post-war prosperity, peace, progress, the economic engines booming, and then yet the reality in the American South, not only of continued economic challenges for people, but also the kind of intense segregation, and particularly the violent segregation in response to, the civil rights movement. And I think that those two kind of aspirational and dystopian aspects of American culture are encapsulated in these two works here. On the right, one of the most beautiful pictures in our collection by Consuela Kanaga, who again actually had a grant to go and travel around and make photographs, and she photographed throughout the South. And she's photographing this young girl in Tennessee, 1948. And what I love is that this is not a sociological picture. She is not photographing this girl as a product of her circumstances. She is really just enhancing her inner beauty, her light. We see her head tilted upward, looking at the sky. It reminds me a lot of sort of classical sculpture, portraiture of children, and this background really monumentalizes this young girl. And on the left, a picture that is really telling a very different story about this woman who was the wife of the first victim of a lynching in Georgia in 1949. And as a little aside, for those of you who see both exhibitions, American Born Hungry and A Long Arc, this picture actually is in both shows. It was not planned that way, but obviously we both found it a powerful work of art. Marion Palfy was a photographer originally from Europe, grew up in a Hungarian family, fled Nazi Germany and moved to New York, and first became involved with kind of artists and writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and then eventually got a grant to travel to the South to make pictures about racial violence, and actually created a book maquette of the subject matter, but was unable to ever find a publisher because the material was just deemed too difficult. But what we see here is the sort of harsh glare of this woman's face and the kind of resignation. And I think that these two pictures really do kind of capture the poles of possibility at this time. Another photographer who plays a major role in the widespread understanding of the American South at this time is Gordon Parks, the first black photographer to work for Life magazine, who in 1955-56 actually made a series of photographs in Alabama, around Mobile, Alabama, that was called Segregation Story. And the photographs really look at the psychological impact of segregation on especially children. You see here, these children literally separated from the opportunity to join others in play. Or here, a young girl and her mother, perhaps grandmother, unable, looking longingly at the clothes and, of course, the the white mannequins, but unable to enter the store. And these pictures were published in Life magazine and really did begin to raise consciousness, far outside of the South about the conditions of segregation. One of the surprises of this show was how many photographers actually came to the American South, ones I never thought of, including Elliot Erwitt, a kind of French-born photographer, documentary photographer, also created a lot of beautiful and very humorous photographs. But his photograph of this kind of Southern charm is really made in a deeply ironic spirit. There's a wonderful quote by him where he talks about the beauty and the gentility of the South and the Southern people until you touch on the one thing that you're not supposed to touch on. And he talks about sort of when it all ends. And then on the right, the magnum French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. I had no idea he came to Richmond in 1960, photographing a group of Confederate widows, daughters of the Confederacy, with quite a canny, incisive, but not too empathetic eye. But perhaps the most famous photographer to sort of make pictures about the American South at this time is Robert Frank. Again, another Swiss-born photographer, another sort of outsider to the United States, who received a Guggenheim grant and traveled across the country in 1955 and 56, photographing the entire country, reduced that huge project to 88 pictures that he published in a book called The Americans. It was actually published in French first, Les Américains, and then published a year later in the United States. And its initial reaction, the initial reactions of many was vehemently negative, both because of the unconventional ways in which Frank photographed, kind of grainy, off-kilter, didn't really seem beautiful, but also because he painted a picture of America that was very much at odds with its image of itself. One kind of, beset by consumerism, decimating its natural resources, and deeply riven and alienated by racial and other forms of segregation. And I think that comes out in this picture here, which he's making of a trolley in New Orleans. And we see the actual kind of way he's using the separation of these windows on the trolley as a kind of metaphor for this divisions between people, with the sort of white sitters in the front, black sitters in the back, but also the expression. I really urge you to look at this picture carefully. The expression on the faces of the individuals, this kind of suspicious look from this woman, the sort of anguished look of this man, and the children who are caught in between and kind of confused and puzzled and worried. And it's sort of amazing to look at the contact sheets for this picture because he's working very fast. The bus is moving, and he stops after this picture. It's like he knew he got it. Frank made other powerful and well-known pictures at this time in the South, and this brings us back to that early daguerreotype, the nanny portraits. And I think what's so extraordinary, we've seen pictures like this before, but what's so extraordinary about Frank's pictures is just how he manages to capture the incredible physical intimacy and yet the incredible distance psychologically between the baby and the woman who cares for him or her. I think it's a him. Now, these pictures were sort of expressions of a kind of public eye, trying to understand the United States through what people saw while they were traveling on the streets. But there were also a number of photographers at this time who really sort of explored the inner worlds. And I think about work like this from Ralph Eugene Meatyard, a Kentucky optician who was also an extraordinary photographer, as being a kind of internalization of the tensions, the psychological tensions of living in a divided society. Meatyard frequently involved his family in his photo shoots. This is his son, Christopher, but also kind of created these dreamlike narratives using costumes and masks. And Meatyard was actually very influential on another photographer from Virginia, Emmett Gowan, who actually went to what is now VCU and made a number of his early pictures, both in Richmond as well as Danville, Virginia. This is made in Richmond, and it's hard to see here, but there's a wonderful chalk drawing in the back, which kind of relates to a lot of the work that Meat Yard did. But we also see here, too, the ways in which Gowan is photographing his wife's family, this kind of very close family, in a way to emphasize their connectedness, their intimacy. And this really also ran counter to a lot of stereotypes around poor white Southerners at this time as sort of grotesque and disconnected and, alienated and not educated. And then just another pair to show you sort of some of that wonderful dialogue between Meat Yard and Gowan. Of course, it's a dog and a girl rather than two people. The next section is the one that is sort of a little bit out of the chronological narrative. My co-curator and I decided, we originally had integrated the civil rights pictures with the pictures you just saw, but we felt that actually it was such a powerful moment, but also that civil rights photography, which really took root in the South and was elaborated in the South, was such a specific language that developed that we wanted to focus on that and kind of highlight it. And it also works perfectly in our space here. We have these little smaller galleries. Civil rights movement and photography are really deeply intertwined. Many of the photographers of the civil rights movement were activists themselves. They were attached to organizations like SNCC, and the activists understood the power of photography to change people's minds. And so it was imperative to have photographers on the scene during any kinds of demonstrations. And the photographers and the activists were very savvy about making sure that the pictures and eventually film of their struggles were widely broadcast. And I really do think that photography played a major role in the success of the civil rights movement in this country. I mean, it really was the photographs and the film of the march, the Selma March, that kind of, I think, was a turning point for many Americans. Pictures of violence like this, both passive resistance and the violence enacted on Black bodies really shocked a lot of Americans who were not particularly cognizant of how, what the civil rights movement was actually entailed for those involved in it, the risk. But there are also other pictures that really touch on sort of the impact on everybody, the kind of alienation of white population. This is the 2/3 empty bus during the bus strike. And there's a kind of also visual language that develops during the civil rights movement. I mean, there's pictures of kind of violence and resistance, or kind of passive resistance to violence, but also these pictures of kind of uplift, very, beautifully shot here by James Corrales. We have this kind of stormy sky that suggests a kind of, a momentous occasion, and the line, we get the sense of almost the endless progression of marchers here, and especially the use of American flags. Here captured by Bruce Davidson, a young boy captured in the flag. And it makes me think back to those carte de visites by Charles Paxson and the children wrapped in the flag, and the ways in which, photographers are very conscious of their work as, kind of participating in a visual economy, one that is really, defined by these symbols. And they're using photography and using these symbols to kind of try to change history. And then there are pictures that really also are touching and surprising. Deanne Arbus is a photographer who's not known for her empathetic portraits. Many of her pictures seem to try to get under the skin of her subjects and show them at their most vulnerable and awkward. But I think even she knew that this was a different kind of picture. This is a picture made of Coretta Scott King 5 days after the assassination of her husband. And I think it's sort of with a mixture of like pain and hope that she looks up to the sky and she's sort of bathed in this glowing light. We're almost there. This is the penultimate section. The second to last section of the exhibition is a little unruly. We called it Returns and Renewals because this is sort of a period after the tumult of the civil rights where people, and a lot of photographers, were kind of grappling with the past and trying to understand the present. This was a moment of another New South with a lot of growth and economic expansion in cities like Atlanta and Nashville and others, and yet, progress didn't seem to filter through the South evenly. But there was also kind of, after the Civil Rights Movement, a sort of return to history, a rethinking of maybe the myths and histories that one grew up with, a rise of revisionist history, and kind of thinking about the past, how to come to terms with Southern identity, and particularly white Southern identity. I think for a lot of photographers who grew up in the South and sort of lived through the Civil Rights Movement, they really had to question what was their inheritance, both photographically and more broadly. We see this pull of history and this kind of impulse to return in the work of somebody like William Christenberry, who is from Hale County, Alabama, the same place where Walker Evans made his pictures, and James Agee wrote the book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And Christenberry was not a photographer until he came across that book sometime in the 1960s, I guess, when it was reprinted. And it inspired him to go back to his hometown and begin to make pictures. And a lot of his work is about returning. He returns to the same place, the same buildings, kind of over and over again, photographing them across time. And it really is sort of an exploration of photography's ability to capture the passage of time. You might also know that's a pop of color here. We haven't seen too much color yet. And that's another major contribution of Southern photography in this period, which is the kind of widespread dissemination of color photography as art photography. Color photography, of course, has been in existence for many years, including widely used for commercial purposes. But most art photography up till this time was really black and white. It was kind of still the hold of Ansel Adams and the zone system on many photographers. And it was William Eggleston, a Memphis-born photographer, who kind of popularized and really was influential on many generations of photographers afterwards for his use of color, but also kind of the merging of like very eye-popping, lurid color with these very everyday subjects, some might say banal. One of his most famous pictures, which we don't have in the show, is just of a red ceiling, very, very red, with a light bulb hanging down. Not everybody understood this aesthetic at the time, but I think it is really, we see the kind of many generations that it's influenced. But I also think that Eggleston was not just photographing light bulbs and coffee cups. He was clearly immersed in and grew up in the kind of social dynamics of the South. And I think the picture that you see on the right very much speaks to his kind of quiet understanding of this inheritance that he had. And his work really influences many generations of extraordinary photographers. Joel Sternfeld's project is part of a major series he did, American Prospects, which was really looking at the kind of state of America during the Reagan years. And so we see that beautiful use of color here. And we see also the kind of quiet understanding of, attempt to understand what is this place that we live in and how do people live together or and apart in the United States. This is made in Sandy Spring, Georgia, just a kind of a nice upper middle class suburb of Atlanta. But it's clear from the title that the women who are standing here, and they look like they're going to be standing for quite some time because I don't see many buses there, are waiting for transportation to take them to where they live. And so we have that, again, that sense of kind of isolation and loneliness and alienation that this divided society can produce. Now, there was a lot of extraordinary work being made in the South at this time, and so much of it also focused on portraiture and community portraiture, and a number of either Southern-born or emigres to the South making very thoughtful portraits in collaboration with their subjects. On the left, a photograph by Baldwin Lee, who was a first-generation Chinese-American photographer who was born in New York City, actually studied with Walker Evans at Yale, and got a teaching job at Knoxville, Tennessee. And it was really only when he came to the American South that he understood actually what he was meant to do as a photographer. He worked with a large format camera. He collaborated closely with his subjects. You can see the exquisite kind of choreography here of figures and expressions to make more than 10,000 photographs of people who he felt otherwise would not be represented in history. And he was very conscious that his work could fall into kind of like a sociological documentation, and he worked very hard to avoid that sort of approach, in part by collaborating with his subjects. And on the right, a work by Wendy Ewald, an artist who uses photography as part of social practice. And she worked with children in Appalachia to help them, to give them the tools to tell their own stories, teaching them photography and encouraging them to write. And this picture is actually a collaboration of three people: Wendy Ewald, who made the picture, Charles, who's in the picture, and Charles's brother, Johnny, who directed the picture. And so it's kind of like a three-part picture. And what I love is that, Johnny basically set up the picture. He told Charles to be behind the quilt and to hold the gun. But I think Charles was the one to point the gun away from the camera. There's something so tender about his expression and so tentative about the way he holds that gun that it's like, even if it's a toy gun, he couldn't quite point it at the camera. And another form of community portraiture by Deborah Lester, a photographer from New Orleans whose own mother was the victim of violence. She was murdered, and that really drew Lester into the world of both crime and punishment. And as she began to explore the American judicial system, she began to really look at the prison system in Louisiana, one of the states that has an extremely high rate of mass incarceration. And she began to photograph in these prisons, making these incredible collaborative portraits with her subjects, two of whom you see here. Sometimes they dress what they want, bring what they want, pose how they want, in this case coming from maybe a passion play. And she's printing these on metal plates to evoke the kind of 19th century tintype. And on the back, she's recording their names, maybe their birth dates, sometimes their sentence, but also details that they wish to include, perhaps the number of children they had. And really, it's a kind of heartbreaking sort of cataloging of both the inhumanity of the kind of judicial system, but also pictures that remind us of the humanity of people who are caught up in it. And finally, artists who are really engaged with the question of history and the heritage of the South and how to come to terms with it. Here's Sally Mann's Scarred Tree. It's part of her series on the Deep South, when she really began to explore the Southern landscape as the site of kind of history and memory and trauma. And of course, there's this amazing scar across the tree, which really, of course, is like the scar of history of the land. But she's also reaching back to history in the way that she's making the photograph. She is ditching, the fast cameras for a 19th century apparatus that takes glass plates. She's pouring her own chemicals on them, putting the plate into the camera while it's still wet, making an exposure mostly by judging light and estimating the time. And then she's using that negative to make gelatin silver prints. And it's really, for her, it's both an attachment to the past of history, to the work of it, but also lots of kind of unexpected things happen in the pictures, swirls or bubbles or streaks, that frequently kind of add to the metaphors that she's seeking out in her pictures. And other photographers at this time are also thinking about history embedded in the land, including Carrie Mae Weems here, who's photographing in the former homes of enslaved people in the Gullah Geechee communities. And here she's pairing the pictures that she's making, which are pictures of emptiness, with folklore, Gullah Geechee folklore, that kind of evoke sort of the notion of flying away and escape. And so she's pairing image and text here to kind of evoke the ancestors of the past. And those of you who saw the Dawood Bey show here last year, Elegy, I think Bey is really kind of continuing that idea of sort of finding the voices, finding the hidden histories within the landscape that we see kind of in these earlier works. And the last section is sort of cheekily entitled A New South Again, because again, this is this kind of theme that, in Southern history is like, are we there yet? Have we transformed? And I think for me, this is one of the most exciting aspects of the exhibition. It's certainly one of the largest in both size, and perhaps the most open-ended and unresolved, because this is the moment that we live in. But we really wanted to show both the breadth of photographic practice, but also the diversity and complexity of the contemporary South. There were a couple themes that we focused on here. One is kind of this engagement with history, but also who is documenting that history now. And I think that comes out really beautifully in this picture by the filmmaker and photographer Ramel Ross. And what we're seeing here is actually an old kind of antebellum mansion in Hale County, Alabama. It's now the third time you've heard it. And it's kind of, a fuzzy background. We could sort of squint and think maybe it's a Walker Evans in color. But we then look at it again as he's holding up the iPhone screen, the kind of contemporary technology that also diminishes the power of this building. And of course, we see his hands framing this picture. And it's really about the insertion of Black subjectivity into spaces that have been both codified and sort of glorified in photo history, but also have really erased Black presence in many ways. Another theme that emerges in this section is not just an attachment to landscape, but really environmental pictures, environmental history. This is part of a series that the landscape photographer Richard Mizrak did in California. Richard from California did in Louisiana in an area called Cancer Alley, which was an area that was the waterways were so poisoned by toxic runoff that the incidence of cancer, gave it that nickname. And we see, of course, other photographers working in the same vein, looking at the aftermath of Katrina. And these pictures, I think, sadly are timeless at this point, or very relevant. And young photographers, too, like Irina Rozovsky, continuing in this tradition of thinking about our relationship to the land, and in particular, the coastal communities in the South. I think now we can add sort of North Carolina to that story. But also the South is a space for kind of imagination. These two works are by Christine Potter, a photographer who works out of Nashville. And it's part of a series called Dark Waters, which came about because she was fascinated with how many places she was coming across in the South that were named after violent acts. Murder Creek is one. Another one was called like Rape Pond, or here, Sodom's Creek. And she began to think about these places, and particularly bodies of water that were associated with danger and violence. And at the same time, she was interested in a genre of American music. Her husband is a musician, so it probably helps. That kind of celebrated and glorified violence against women. These are sort of like late 19th, early 20th century songs that are sort of, jaunty about meeting a girl, and then, oops, she gets pregnant, and I had to get rid of her kind of thing. So she brings these together in these kind of imagined narratives. And then, of course, we are living in a moment of cultural conflict and discord everywhere in the United States, but I think it's taken particularly salient form in the South and in Richmond in the last couple of years. And both of these pictures are about violence, even though one looks incredibly quiet and perhaps is not just a small nod to Edward Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. But we see here, the aftermath of a Black Lives Matter protest. And one of the protesters is holding the sign, "Abolish the police." And the last couple pictures really are just about youth and hope. There are a number of young photographers in this show who are focusing on the diversity of their own communities and communities in the South. Tommy Ka, who's a Chinese, Vietnamese, queer photographer who grew up outside of Memphis, very much in the shadow of Elvis, which he takes on by photographing a cutout of himself in a kind of the Elvis Hawaii suit. And on the left, Jose Ibarra Rizo, who is a photographer born in Mexico who focuses on the immigrant communities who labor to build this country, but who are very often invisible in its kind of pictorial economy. Or artists like our own Richmond Susan Worsham on the right, Raheem Fortune on the left. And really this focus, I think, on youth in their pictures as well as their own youth is really heartening for me as somebody who loves to work with young photographers now, no longer just dead ones. And I think I'll end on this picture, which is by a young photographer, Irina Rozovsky. When Greg and I were putting together the book, we were so concerned to not fall into those stereotypes of the South as like moonlight magnolias and Southern, and the kind of Spanish moss and the kudzu everywhere, that we realized that we had no pictures that kind of spoke to that beauty, that imagination, that tradition of sort of imagining the South as this magical place. And so I think this picture kind of does it. We see this beautiful setting with the Spanish moss, this kind of strange abandoned carriage in the middle of nowhere, but also little reminders and remnants that this is the contemporary world. And I think it also just speaks to the magic of photography too, that this show has a lot of difficult pictures, and our history is difficult, but photography can also inspire us to imagine other ways of living. That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you for your patience.